Okay, so these are going to be our notes on the judicial branch. So far we've covered the legislative branch, which really legislative branch consists of Congress, which is the Senate and the House of Representatives, and their main function is to create laws. And then we also covered the executive branch, and that includes the president, his cabinet. And the main function of the executive branch is to lead the country and to enforce the laws. So now we're on to the judicial branch. Let me do this here real quick. So the judicial branch, their main function is that they just make sure all the laws and actions of other branches match the Constitution. So, and you're going to see here, one of the main entities of the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. So these are judges that look at the actions and the laws being passed in the Senate and in the House of Representatives, and how each of these branches, the legislative and the executive, are acting, and the things that they're doing, are they matching what the Constitution says that they can do. So this all has to do about matching what's going on in the country to the Constitution. And as it says here, all laws that are passed today are based on the original document, the Constitution. So it all starts here. Whatever was written in the original Constitution, if you make a new law, it has to match whatever's in there. And if it's not, the Supreme Court can then strike that law down, and it no longer is in effect. The formation of the judicial branch is found in Article 3 of the Constitution. Let's go ahead and see what that says. If you check this out here, it's kind of interesting because there's different types of different courts. It's not just the Supreme Court. We have our district court in Glen Allen. We have federal court in Anchorage. They have a courthouse in Fairbanks, and each one of these are courts, but in the original document of the Constitution, only the Supreme Court was really formed. Okay. And if we look here, Section 1, the judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. And then the important part is it also left an opening. So when they first wrote the Constitution, they realized, right now we might only need a Supreme Court, but in the future we might need more. So let's leave an opening for those to be formed. And this is, so that happens in this wording here. It says, in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. Okay. And also some important things here. It says the judges of both the supreme and inferior courts shall hold their office during good behavior, and shall at all times receive of their service compensation, which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office. So provides that they get paid, and they must have good behavior, which is kind of interesting. So if we then go back to this notes, so then that's the Article 3. So Article 3 deals with the forming of the judicial branch. Okay, and this really is dealing, though, which we always want to remember, is dealing with federal law. Okay, now you might have, because you also have, if we add to this, we have state law. So, and there are some laws that are different from state to state, just because they're different places. So the things that are in effect in Alaska are probably going to be very different, or the laws, or some of the laws, are going to be very different than they are somewhere on the East Coast, or somewhere even like in Texas. So there's lots of different laws that interact and that are controlled by the judicial branch. But the main thing they deal with is federal law, and that's really just talking about going back to the Constitution. So if a state passes a law, it can't be unconstitutional, so it has to match the Constitution. Now the state has certain rights that maybe are not mentioned in the Constitution, and they can write their laws that way, that's fine, but they can't write laws that are unconstitutional. That's why just recently, if you were paying attention with the Marriage Act, was it between a man and a woman, a man and a man? So then the Supreme Court struck that down, saying, well, in the Constitution it says this, and even though you've passed this law in the state, they said that the Constitution defines it this way. So that's how the Supreme Court could strike down state laws. So, but it all comes back to the Constitution. Okay, so, but the judicial branch really consists of three main courts, but the Supreme Court is the highest law of the land. And if we look at these three courts here, let's go to this one. This is the judicial branch. I'll just erase this stuff here. And so if we look at this diagram right here talks about, this is the highest law of the land, U.S. Supreme Court. They can cancel anything else out. Okay, and then we have that ties into the U.S. Supreme Court are Court of Appeals and district courts, and these are just federal. Okay, so these have to do with federal matters, and so usually if it's a federal matter, it will start at this district court, and you see here there's 94 courts. Every state at least has at least one. Okay, some have more, and then if something happens and you don't agree here, it can then go to the Court of Appeals. And then if something happens and you still don't agree, you can appeal it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and maybe they'll hear it, maybe they won't. And even here, the the Federal District Court, they may appeal to one of these 13 courts, but they may not hear it either. They have to be convinced that there is a possibility that something was wrong. But also you have, in the middle here, you see these state courts. So you have these local trial courts. This would be like if somebody broke a law in, say, in Glen Allen, they robbed somebody, and then they would be arrested and they would go to court, and they'd have a jury, trial by jury, and this would be as well. This would be a trial by jury. But then if something happened in that, the state court, they also have an appeals court here as well. So they're very similar. Okay. And then they can also have a Pennsylvania, Alaska, Colorado, a Supreme Court there, and which also, in the end, has to give way to this U.S. Supreme Court and what they say. There's also some minor courts that they don't really usually talk about, you don't hear much about, but these are military courts and military appeals, Court of Claims, and then of international trade. So these kind of are other courts that you don't hear very much about. Usually it's just the state courts and the federal courts. Okay, so we go back. So those are the three main courts, and if we continue here, taking notes. Okay, so then if we look at the Supreme Court, like I was saying before, they're the highest court in the land. So what they decide is the ultimate decision. So you might have something decided by a state, but if somebody keeps taking it up higher and higher, eventually if it gets to the Supreme Court can then overrule the state court. Okay, and because you see here, state and federal jurisdiction, because in the end it all ties back into the main body of law in our country, and that's the U.S. Constitution. So the main body of law. And that's the U.S. Constitution. So some people are very explicit with the Constitution. You've maybe heard this in the news. They say if it's not in the Constitution, then you can't really, the Supreme Court has no say on it. And really, depending on the type of justice you have, you might have a justice that kind of reads things into what's already in there. Not as conservative, maybe more liberal, but then really conservative judges, they would probably say, well, I don't see it explicitly written here, so it goes back to the states to decide. Okay, and like I said, absolute and final ruling. Let's check that out, see what that says. So we check that out, and so I wanted to show you this. These are the latest cases, and you can actually hear them. So like if you go to this link, It tells you about the cases they're hearing, and you can even hear some of them. Okay, so recent arguments, Fisher versus University of Texas Austin. You can hear it if you just choose this. You can then listen to the case, as you can kind of hear that. Okay, so you can even hear some of these cases that they're the Supreme Court hears. And I don't know, Dollar General versus Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, Liberty Mutual Insurance, Merrill Lynch. You can see these different cases as federal cases, and you can even look at the transcript and listen to them if you want to hear what it is like to be sitting in the court and hearing people argue law. And that's kind of, you want to check this out if you want. So if we go back to this, okay, so the absolute and final ruling. And there's 9 judges total. There wasn't always 9, there was less originally, but then over time they've added some, they've taken some away, and now we have the grand total of 9. Okay, in those 9 there's 1 chief and 8 associates. So one person really is like the leader of it all. So somebody gets appointed this. There's been a lot of famous ones. I'm going to go to a list here in a minute, and so let's check these out. So here are all the list of Supreme Court justices we've ever had. It's a Wikipedia thing, but it works all right. So first Justice, Chief Justice Supreme Court was John Jay. Let's see if we can see anybody you might know. John Marshall, pretty famous one. Let's see anybody else here. No. William Taft was actually a president and a Supreme Court justice. Today you can even see that many of the senators are lawyers as well. Let's see if we know any. Earl Warren is a pretty famous one. You might have heard of him. William Rehnquist is one of the most recent ones. And then John Roberts is the Chief Justice today. And he was appointed on September 6th. And then let's see, how long did some of these guys... So you see this guy, September 26th, 1986 to 2015. So you got 14, 19, almost 20 years he was on this. He was the Chief Justice. He was, pointing things in a certain direction. Okay. You can see some of these. This is the days they were in office. I think that's what that is, term. Yeah, length of service. This is very short. Some of these guys are really not very long. This guy, John Marshall, 12,570 days. You can see he was the Chief Justice for 34 years. That's a long time. And even Taney there. But you can check this list out. Taft was only Supreme Court for 3,000 days. Usually it's not that long. Usually it's shorter period. You can see here 9 years. But some of them are in there a long time, and they can really shape the direction of laws in our country. And some people don't like that. Because if we look here, there's no term limit. It's a lifetime appointment. And so once you get in there, so if you look at Justice Roberts here, go back to him. It gives his birth there now. Let's see. So it doesn't say when he was born, but maybe it goes back up top here. Didn't say. Okay, so, but he doesn't look very old. He could be in office for 20-some years and steering cases a certain way. And some people really argue against that. That there should be a term limit. Maybe they should be 8 years or 12 years or 16 years, and who really knows what that should be. But there's also the argument with this is wisdom from time. So the longer you're judging law, the more cases you see, the better outlook you would have on something. And then there's some truth in that. Okay, and also these are nominated by the president. Okay, so they're not elected. Now, if you're state Supreme Court or one of these lower offices or judges, then you would be voted on perhaps. But these Supreme Court are nominated by the president, so they have no political affiliation usually. So, you can look at their cases and see, how they've ruled in the past and the direction they've gone, but they tend to do this because they're nominated, then they have to be approved by Congress, so they tend to be not political. Now sometimes people politicize it and say they are, but really they shouldn't be. Okay. And then so that's the Supreme Court, the basic outline of it. And then if we continue on here and go to the Court of Appeals is the next one. So this is the highest. The next one below is the Court of Appeals. There's only 13 of those. Supreme Court, there's only one. So 13 Court of Appeals. So every state does not have one. So if you want to reach this Court of Appeals, you might have to go to a different state. Okay, and these appeal decisions from district courts that cannot be resolved, and we'll come back to this one in a minute. And these usually consist of 3 judges. So, but that's the Court of Appeals. And the lowest level, the place usually that you start at, is the district court. Okay, and these are local level cases. So these are cases that are deal with Anchorage or Kenny Lake, and they start here. And these have quite a few, 94 total courts. So every state has one, and you could take it. It's not really hard to present a case here. But in this district court, if something happens and you still think it's not fair or it's not right, and you want to appeal it, you can then take it to the Court of Appeals. And then if one of these 13, you can choose which one you want to go to, I think. And then if they accept your case, these 3 judges will hear it, and then they decide whether you're right or not. And then even if you don't agree with these guys, then you can go to the Supreme Court as well. Okay, but this is more your local level deal here. So then the last thing to remember, though, is that all these courts, as I was showing you that diagram, is they're all intertwined with state courts as well. So you have things going on in state courts that may eventually end up in federal court, or vice versa, I guess. But when you see Supreme Court, you want to make sure, is it the Alaska State Supreme Court or is the U.S. Supreme Court? And in the end, remember, for our judicial branch of our federal government, it's district courts, Court of Appeals, and then Supreme Court. And this one is the law of the land. They decide what's right. They can make something unconstitutional. They can reinforce something. So, and the thing to remember about the Supreme Court is if they say it's okay, you can't override it. So, so if they decide an issue, you can't keep bringing it back. So if these 9 justices say that something like driving your car on Sunday is a law that says you can't do that, if they say that's constitutional, then there's nothing you can do about it. You can't then take the same argument back to them, because they would say, well, we've already determined that law and you can't bring it back. It'd have to be something a little different. Okay, so that's what some people worry about this, because they just, depending on the court, they determine the outcome, and then there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, you can't keep bringing it back over and over the same thing. It'd have to be something a little different. So that's our notes on the judicial branch. Make sure you annotate these, add to them, and that should be good.